Mariana Cruz was the personification of the cold competence that kept the largest public hospital in Mexico City running amidst the chaos. At 40, her reputation as head nurse preceded her. She was a figure of silent authority whose eyes had witnessed more tragedies than the yellowed walls of that place. An orphan since childhood and raised by a stern grandmother, Mariana found in nursing not a profession, but a penance, a way to atone for the guilt of not having been able to save her own family. Every life that passed through her hands was a reminder of her failure, a constant echo of the loss that had hollowed her out from within. She moved through the corridors like a ghost in a white uniform, efficient and distant, a guardian on the threshold between life and death, carrying a burden that no one knew. It's a dark journey, and if you're here, it's because you understand the weight of these stories. I really want to reach 1,000 subscribers to keep bringing tales like this, so please subscribe and comment from which city you're following this dive into Mariana's darkness. Her path was a long corridor of losses, culminating in the night her husband and her little daughter were torn from her life with a brutality that shattered her soul. Since then, Mariana operated in a state of emotional numbness, a vacuum filled only by the incessant beeping of heart monitors and the smell of antiseptic that clung to her skin. The hospital became her refuge and her prison, a place where the suffering of others drowned out her own. She wore her mask of professionalism with the same precision with which she administered an injection, a disguise that concealed the broken woman inside, whose dreams were invaded by the sound of her daughter's laughter, abruptly silenced forever. Pain was a constant companion, a shadow that followed her in every procedure, in every diagnosis, transforming her compassion into a cold, calculated fury against the injustice of the world. The irony of her existence was palpable in her hands. With an almost surgical dexterity, she could bring a man on the brink of death back to life, stabilizing a hemorrhage with a calmness that frightened the younger doctors. On one particularly chaotic night, a young man shot in a gang dispute arrived with his chest torn open. While others panicked, Mariana orchestrated his care with robotic efficiency, her nimble fingers working to stanch the gushing blood, her firm commands cutting through the tense air of the emergency room. She saved that boy, but as she looked at his face, she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just the cold emptiness of her mission, the realization that saving one life did not fill the hole left by the ones she couldn't protect. The hero of the emergency room was an empty shell. The hospital was a revolving stage for the city's cruelty. Traffickers, murderers, and rapists were brought in, often injured in clashes with the police or rival gangs, and they received the same dedicated care as the innocent victims in the beds next to them. Mariana watched this perverse cycle with a growing disgust. She saw the flawed justice system in action, patching up monsters so they could return to the streets and destroy more families. This realization corroded her faith in justice, replacing it with a grim pragmatism. The law, to her, was a bad joke told by corrupt men in distant courtrooms, while here, on the blood-soaked floor of her hospital, the true consequence of impunity manifested in shattered bodies and ruined lives. The seed of an alternative justice began to germinate in her mind. Her isolation was a fortress. She kept her colleagues at a safe distance, offering only the professional version of herself. Sophia, a younger nurse who tried to get close with trivial conversations, received monosyllabic answers. Dr. Felipe Ramirez, an idealistic resident who saw Mariana as a model of excellence, was treated with the same clinical formality. These interactions were like medical procedures to her, necessary but devoid of any human warmth. She couldn't afford to have friends or confidants, as they might see the cracks in her armor, the darkness that was accumulating inside her. Loneliness was the price of her vigil, the sanctuary where she could nurture her grief and plan her silent war. The atmosphere of the hospital was a reflection of her tortured soul. The long, poorly lit corridors seemed to stretch on infinitely, echoing the groans of the sick and the hurried footsteps of the staff. The cold white light of the fluorescent lamps bathed everything in a cadaverous pallor, accentuating the contrast between the sterility of the environment and the brutality of the wounds that arrived there. The sound was a constant cacophony, the cry of a mother, the scream of pain, the rhythmic beep of a machine keeping someone alive, and the distant sirens that announced the arrival of yet another tragedy. For Mariana, that place was not a sanctuary of healing, but a purgatory, a microcosm of the violence and abandonment that plagued the city and her own heart. The memory of that night was a shard of glass lodged in her brain, impossible to remove. It wasn't a complete memory, but sensory flashes that assaulted her at the most unexpected moments. The smell of popcorn that her husband Ricardo had made, the feel of her daughter Anna's dress, only 6 years old, as she danced around the living room, the sound of the door being kicked in, a fracture in the happy symphony of her life, and above all, the sound of Anna's laughter, a tinkling crystal that shattered into a deafening silence. These fragments were her Bible and her curse, the gospel of her pain, the sacred text that would justify the acts she was about to commit. Every detail fueled the cold flame that now burned in her chest. In the sterile quiet of a supply closet, surrounded by boxes of gauze and saline bags, Mariana finally allowed herself a fraction of vulnerability. The chaos of the emergency room, muffled by the metal door, seemed a distant world. There, in the silence, the weight of her journey became almost unbearable. A single, hot, lonely tear traced a path down her exhausted face, a small betrayal of her iron facade. It was the baptism of her new identity. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her uniform, her jaw tight, her eyes hardening again. The moment of weakness passed. As she opened the door and returned to the noisy corridors, she was no longer just a nurse. She was an angel of death, waiting patiently, with a syringe as her sword and a twisted justice as her creed. The night dragged on with the slowness of an intravenous drip, each second marked by the monotonous beep of the machines. It was then that the emergency room doors burst open violently, bringing with them the smell of gunpowder and fresh blood. On a gurney pushed hurriedly by panting paramedics lay a man whose face Mariana could never forget. It was him, El Hierro, the cartel leader, the architect of her pain, now reduced to a bloody and frail body. Time seemed to freeze. The sounds of the hospital faded into a low hum, and all Mariana could see was the face of the monster that haunted her nightmares. Seeing him there, vulnerable and on the verge of death in her territory, did not bring the satisfaction she might have imagined. Instead, a wave of nausea and glacial fury coursed through her, awakening the darkness she had nurtured for years in a sepulchral silence. The doctors and nurses swarmed, surrounding El Hierro's body with the urgency reserved for any critically ill patient. Mariana watched from a distance, paralyzed by a whirlwind of memories. She saw his arrogant smile in the courtroom, the way impunity cloaked him like a shroud. Now that same man was receiving top-notch care, the same procedures that could have saved her family. The irony was a twisted blade in her chest. The machine of medicine, which she served with such devotion, was working to save the life that had destroyed hers. Every compression on his chest, every drug injected into his veins, was an insult to the memory of her husband and daughter. The neutrality of her profession, once a pillar of her identity, now seemed an unbearable betrayal. As Dr. Ramirez shouted orders and tried to stabilize the criminal, Mariana's eyes fixed on a detail, a teardrop tattoo under El Hierro's left eye, the same mark she saw on that fateful night. That small detail broke the dam of her restraint. The dormant pain exploded into a lucid, cutting rage. It was no longer about grief or abstract justice. It became visceral, personal. The system had freed him once. She would not let it happen again. The sight of her family's murderer fighting for breath in her hospital, under her care, was the catalyst that transformed years of passive suffering into an active need for intervention. The nurse who swore to save lives felt the executioner who would take one being. Born within her, the decision crystallized in her mind with the clarity of a scalpel. She approached the team, her expression unreadable, her mask of professionalism perfectly in place. "I'll take it from here," she said, her voice firm, belying the storm raging inside her. The others, accustomed to her authority, stepped back without question. As she touched El Hierro's skin, a shiver of revulsion and power ran through her. She was the guardian of his life at that moment. The choice was hers. The Hippocratic oath turned to ash in her mind, replaced by a vow of vengeance made to the ghost of her daughter. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about all the other families that would be destroyed if he walked out of that hospital alive. With steady hands, she prepared a syringe, not with a life-saving drug, but with a lethal combination of potassium chloride hidden from prying eyes. The world narrowed to that small act of rebellion against fate and the law. There, on that hospital bed, Mariana declared her silent war. She would no longer wait for a justice that would never come. If the system was incapable of protecting the innocent, she herself would become the instrument of punishment. From that moment on, she decided to act. This was her promise, her new oath. Every criminal who crossed her path would not find a cure, but the end of the line. The nurse was dead. The vigilante had just been born. That was her call to action, the decision that would set her on a path of no return, and she embraced it with all the strength of her broken soul. After El Hierro's death, recorded as a cardiac complication from his injuries, a sinister calm settled over Mariana. There was no euphoria, just the feeling of a completed job, a knot untied in her throat. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, and the act, instead of frightening her, brought her a dark sense of purpose. Her personal revenge quickly metamorphosed into a mission. With unrestricted access to patient records, she began her silent hunt. A known trafficker admitted with appendicitis, a convicted rapist injured in a bar fight. They all became targets. Her vast medical knowledge was her weapon. She mastered the art of faking fatalities, using undetectable drug cocktails that induced cardiac arrest or respiratory failure, sadly common events in an overcrowded, under-resourced hospital. She was judge, jury, and executioner, all under the guise of a guardian angel. Mariana's routine transformed into a meticulous ritual. By day, she was the exemplary head nurse, efficient and demanding, ensuring no detail was overlooked. By night, she became a predator, studying charts, cross-referencing information with crime news and waiting for the perfect opportunity. The hospital, once her refuge, was now her hunting ground. Every dark corridor, every ICU bed was a strategic point. She learned to manipulate shift schedules, divert the attention of colleagues, and forge records with frightening precision. Her facade of professional coldness became her best defense, a wall that kept her from being questioned. No one would suspect the nurse who dedicated her life to saving others, and it was precisely in this invisibility that her power resided. She moved between life and death with an authority the law had never given her. One day, a notorious murderer, responsible for the deaths of an entire family in a robbery, arrived with multiple fractures after a police chase. The case was identical to her own tragedy, and the sight of that man awakened a renewed fury in Mariana. She waited until the dead of night, when the ward was quietest. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she entered the room. The man was sleeping, the sound of his regular breathing filling the space. To the world, he was a patient. To her, he was a ghost from her past, a reincarnation of the evil that took everything from her. She prepared the syringe, her hands no longer trembling. The hesitation of the first time had given way to a steely resolve. This act wasn't just revenge, it was prevention. It was so that no other child would lose their parents because of this monster. The murderer's death was recorded as a pulmonary embolism, a plausible complication for someone with his injuries. Life in the hospital went on, but a seed of doubt was planted. Dr. Ramirez, who was caring for the patient, found the death too sudden, almost artificial. He reviewed the charts, the medication dosages, the nursing reports signed by Mariana, but found nothing out of place. Still, an unease gnawed at him. He admired Mariana's competence, but her presence in the final moments of several high-risk patients began to form a subtle and disturbing pattern in his mind. He had no proof, only a growing intuition that the head nurse, with her impassive demeanor, hid a terrible secret beneath layers of professionalism and pain. The wave of criminal deaths in the city's largest public hospital did not go unnoticed for long. It landed on the desk of Detective Santiago Rios, a middle-aged man with a weary look that had already seen the worst of human nature, but who still clung to an unbending code of ethics. Rios didn't believe in coincidences, especially when the victim shared such a specific profile. He was an old-school cop who trusted his gut and meticulous fieldwork more than statistics. At first, his superiors dismissed the case as gang cleanup, or simply fate taking its toll. But Rios sensed there was something more, an intelligence, a precision to the events that intrigued and deeply alarmed him. Rios began his investigation discreetly, requesting the files of the deceased patients under the pretext of a routine audit. He sat in his cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, and began to draw connections. All the victims were known criminals. All the deaths were attributed to plausible medical complications, but the frequency was statistically improbable. The detective noticed a recurring name on the reports: head nurse Mariana Cruz. She was on duty during almost every incident. At first, he saw her as a possible witness, an experienced professional who might have noticed something strange. The idea that she could be the perpetrator seemed absurd, a movie fantasy, but his instinct told him not to rule out any possibility, no matter how unlikely. The detective decided to visit the hospital. His presence caused a slight stir, but Mariana received him in her office with the same unshakable calm. She answered his questions with precise clinical responses, describing the protocols and the chaotic nature of the emergency room. Rios watched her closely, trying to find a crack in her composure. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the pain that seemed permanently etched on her features, but he saw no guilt or fear. He saw a woman who had built a fortress around herself. The interview revealed nothing incriminating, but it strengthened Rios's conviction. This woman was not just a witness, she was the center of the mystery, and he felt that unraveling her secret would be like disarming a bomb. Meanwhile, Felipe Ramirez's suspicion deepened. He began to watch Mariana secretly, noticing her late-night trips to the records room, her particular interest in certain newly arrived patients. One time he followed her and saw her standing in front of the room of a kidnapping ringleader, just watching the heart monitor for a long time, her expression a mixture of hatred and concentration. The sight chilled him. He found himself in a torturous moral dilemma. Reporting his suspicions without proof could destroy the career of a respected nurse and his own. However, remaining silent could make him an accomplice to something monstrous. His admiration for her turned to fear, and the mentoring relationship he cherished began to crumble under the weight of what he suspected. A confrontation was inevitable. Felipe approached Mariana in an empty hallway, his voice trembling slightly. He spoke about the coincidences, about the pattern of deaths, about his ethical concerns. Mariana listened without interrupting, her face a mask of neutrality. When he finished, she neither defended herself nor became angry. Instead, she used her pain as both a shield and a weapon. She spoke of the fallibility of medicine, of how, despite all their efforts, they lost patients every day, and then, with calculated vulnerability. She mentioned the loss of her family, the pain of seeing the system fail, connecting her personal tragedy to the harsh reality of their work. The manipulation was masterful. Felipe felt guilty for his suspicion, his logic shaken by the empathy he felt for her. Mariana knew she had bought time, but she also knew Felipe's suspicion wouldn't disappear. He was an idealist, attached to medical ethics in a way she no longer was. The tension between them became almost palpable, an electric current of mistrust pervading every interaction. She needed to be even more careful, for now she had eyes watching her from within. The young doctor who saw her as a mentor had become a potential threat, an intimate obstacle that was far more dangerous than the police investigation. The dynamic between them turned into a subtle chess match where every move, every word could lead to checkmate. Mariana felt the net closing in, not just from the outside with the police, but also from within. In the corridors. She considered her domain. With every life she took, a piece of Mariana's humanity eroded. The nightmares became more vivid, not just with memories of her family, but with the faces of her victims, their eyes fading as the poison took effect. During the day, she functioned with robotic precision, but at night, the loneliness of her apartment became a torture chamber. She looked in the mirror and saw the eyes of a murderer. Guilt was a slow poison, corroding her from the inside. She wondered if she had become the same kind of monster she hunted, if her quest for justice had turned her into a more sophisticated version of the brutality she so despised. The line between right and wrong had become an indistinguishable blur. On a night of despair, sitting on the cold floor of her room, she held the only remaining portrait of her family. The tears she suppressed at the hospital flowed freely, silent sobs that shook her body. She spoke to them, asking for forgiveness for what she had become, and at the same time reaffirming her promise. She knew she was lost, that her soul was forever stained, but she believed her sacrifice was necessary. It was a burden she chose to bear, so that other families would not have to carry the same grief she did. That conviction was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart, the anchor in her sea of insanity. Detective Rios, on the other hand, was getting closer to the truth. He began interviewing other hospital staff members, discreetly gathering small pieces of information. Nurse Sophia, in her innocence, mentioned how Mariana seemed harsher, more distant since the deaths of certain specific patients. She told Rios about Mariana's personal tragedy, a detail the detective hadn't known. The information was like a key turning in a lock. Suddenly, the pattern of victims wasn't just about criminals, it was about a specific type of criminal, those who echoed Mariana's trauma. The motive, once obscure, now became terrifyingly clear. The investigation was no longer just professional, it took on a personal and urgent dimension. Mariana felt the pressure mounting. The looks from her colleagues seemed different, laden with suspicion. Whispers in the hallways stopped when she approached. Paranoia became her constant companion. Every step, every decision was calculated to avoid detection. She had a scare when, while disposing of a syringe, she was almost caught by Sophia. She managed to disguise the moment with a quick excuse, but her heart pounded. The hospital, which was once her sanctuary and hunting ground, was turning into a trap. The walls seemed to be closing in around her, and the sense of control she so valued was slipping through her fingers. The hunter was slowly becoming the hunted. Rios's net tightened. He placed Mariana under discreet surveillance, monitoring her movements, her routines. He knew he needed concrete proof, something that directly linked her hands to the deaths. The final piece of the puzzle was missing. Mariana, for her part, felt the invisible presence of the law on the back of her neck. She became more reclusive, her movements more calculated, her mask of indifference even more impenetrable. The silent war she was waging in the hospital beds was about to spill over into the real world, and she knew the final confrontation was a matter of time. The tension was a steel wire stretched to its breaking point, ready to snap at any moment. To complicate matters further, Dr. Ramirez took action. Unable to live with the doubt, he began collecting blood samples from patients he considered at risk, storing them secretly for independent toxicological analysis. He didn't want to go to the police, still clinging to a spark of loyalty and the hope that he was wrong. His intention was to confront Mariana with irrefutable proof, to force her to confess, perhaps even to help her. He didn't realize that his search for an ethical truth was putting him directly in the path of a desperate, cornered woman, and that his noble intention could have fatal consequences for them both. Mariana's loneliness was overwhelming. The only person she truly talked to was Sophia, the young nurse. But even those interactions were superficial. Sophia, with her optimistic view of life, represented everything Mariana had lost: hope, lightness, the ability to see the good in the world. Sometimes, Mariana would find herself watching Sophia laugh with other colleagues and feel a pang of envy and sadness. Each of Sophia's smiles was a reminder of the darkness consuming her. This connection, however fragile, served as a mirror, reflecting the image of the monster she was becoming and the humanity she sacrificed each night. Rios found out about Dr. Ramirez's parallel investigation through an informant in the lab. He realized the danger the young doctor was in. If Mariana found out, her reaction would be unpredictable. The detective decided he needed to act faster before Ramirez's idealism turned him into the next victim. The hunt for Mariana became a race against time, not just to enforce the law, but to prevent another tragedy within the walls of that cursed hospital. He knew he was dealing with a woman who had nothing left to lose, and that made her the most dangerous person in the city. Mariana began to feel the weight of her choices physically: insomnia, loss of appetite, tremors in her hands that she had to hide. The constant tension was undermining her health. The burden of being a lone vigilante was too heavy. In moments of introspection, she questioned if it was all worth it. Vengeance had filled the void, but it had also poisoned it. The pain of her loss was still there, now accompanied by guilt and fear. The peace she sought seemed more distant than ever. She was trapped in a cycle of violence of her own making, and there was no apparent way out. The atmosphere in the hospital became suffocating. The police investigation was the main topic of conversation, though no one dared to speak of it openly. The staff was divided between those who secretly supported the idea of a cleaner for criminals and those who were terrified by the possibility of a serial killer in their hallways. Mariana navigated this sea of paranoia, feeling the stares and whispers like needles on her skin. The loyalty of her colleagues was uncertain, and trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every day was a test of her ability to maintain her composure. Mariana intercepted an email between Dr. Ramirez and a private lab requesting a full toxicology panel for an unofficial sample. The discovery hit her like a punch to the gut. The young doctor she had manipulated and underestimated was about to expose her. The betrayal, as she saw it, was the final proof that she could trust no one. Her first reaction was the instinct of self-preservation: eliminate him. But the thought of killing Felipe, an innocent, an idealist, disgusted her. He was not a monster like the others. Killing him would definitively turn her into the very thing she swore to destroy. The dilemma paralyzed her. Detective Rios, aware of the email through his own means, prepared a team to intervene. He knew the confrontation between Mariana and Ramirez was imminent. He didn't want to arrest Mariana in a spectacle of violence. Somewhere in the depths of his weary heart, he felt a reluctant compassion for her. He understood the pain that drove her, the failure of the system that pushed her into the abyss. But the law was the law. He hoped he could apprehend her before she made another irreversible decision, before she destroyed the last spark of humanity that might still exist within her. Meanwhile, an unexpected event was about to throw the hospital into absolute chaos. A rival cartel, in a bold show of force, decided to attack a convoy transporting one of its injured leaders. The convoy's destination, the public hospital where Mariana worked. The news came like a thunderclap, announcing the perfect storm. Rios's investigation, Mariana's dilemma with Ramirez, everything was about to be swallowed by a wave of violence that would turn the sanctuary of healing into a war zone. Mariana heard the first sirens approaching, not the familiar sound of ambulances, but the aggressive wail of police cars. She looked out the window and saw the beginning of the siege. Amidst the panic that was beginning to take hold of the staff, she felt a terrifying clarity. The outside world was bringing the war to her doorstep, and at the center of that war, she knew, would be the final chance to complete her mission or to meet her own destruction. The approaching chaos was not an obstacle. It was the perfect stage for her final act. The news spread like wildfire. El Hierro had not died. Mariana's first victim was not the cartel boss, but one of his trusted men, a body double used to mislead enemies. The real El Hierro was being brought to the hospital at that very moment, gravely wounded in the convoy attack. The revelation hit Mariana with the force of a defibrillator. Her first kill, the act that defined her, was a mistake. The vengeance she thought she had achieved was an illusion. And now fate was giving her a second chance, the most dangerous and chaotic of all, to come face to face with the true demon of her past. The development of her journey had reached a boiling point. Chaos erupted. The sound of gunfire shattered the night, drowning out the sirens. Members of the rival cartel stormed the emergency room, turning the healing corridors into a battlefield. Patients and staff screamed, seeking shelter wherever they could. Amidst the widespread panic, Mariana moved with a deadly calm, her purpose clearer than ever. The siege that had cornered her became her smokescreen. While Detective Rios, who was outside coordinating the police response, tried to restore order, Mariana saw the disorder as her greatest ally. She knew where they would take El Hierro, to the surgical wing, the most secure area and, ironically, the heart of her domain. The war had come to her home, and she was ready to be the host. Her world was reduced to a single objective: to get through the crossfire and reach the man who destroyed her life. As she navigated the smoke-filled and fearful corridors, she found Dr. Ramirez trying to protect a group of nurses, including Sophia. The look they exchanged was fraught with a tacit, terrible understanding. Felipe no longer saw his mentor, but a relentless force of nature, and in her eyes he no longer saw an accuser, but a young idealist forced to face the brutality of the world. "Stay with them. Keep them safe," Mariana ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. That command was not just practical, it was an act of transference, a final gesture of protection, delegating to him the role of savior that she had abandoned. She was choosing her final path, and it involved leaving behind the last vestiges of her old life, including the tenuous human connection she still had. The journey to the surgical wing was a descent into hell. Mariana used her intimate knowledge of the hospital, moving through service passages and dark corridors, avoiding both the cartel gunmen and the police officers who were beginning to invade the building. With every step, the sounds of battle grew more intense, a rhythmic accompaniment to the violent beat of her own heart. She felt no fear, only an icy clarity. All of her acts, all of her kills, had led her to this very moment. It was the culmination of her pain and her fury. The nurse who once cried in a supply closet had been utterly consumed by the vigilante, a shadow with a mission, ready for the final sacrifice in the name of a vengeance that had become her only reason to live. She finally reached the antechamber of the operating room. El Hierro, sedated and vulnerable on a gurney, was being prepped for emergency surgery. The small medical team present was visibly terrified by the violence outside. With the authority of her position, Mariana dismissed them all. "I'll take care of him. Go help the other wounded," she said, her voice sounding credible amidst the pandemonium. Alone with her enemy, the silence of the room contrasted absurdly with the war outside. His face, once a symbol of power and cruelty, was now pale and weak. She approached, the syringe with the lethal dose in her pocket, feeling like it weighed a ton. This was the moment, the perfect opportunity, the conclusion of her saga. He opened his eyes, the sedation beginning to wear off, and recognized her. A flicker of arrogance mixed with fear crossed his face. "You," he whispered with difficulty. Mariana didn't answer. Instead of anger, she felt a profound emptiness. Killing him like this, defenseless, seemed too easy. It wasn't justice. It was just extermination. And then she saw Detective Rios enter the room, gun drawn, his exhausted face pleading with her not to do it. It was in that moment of hesitation that she knew what she had to do. The choice wasn't between killing him or letting him live for the flawed system. There was a third path, one that would give him the punishment he deserved, but at a terrible cost to herself. Her transformation demanded a final act that reflected the complexity of her journey. With surprising speed, she didn't administer the lethal injection. Instead, she grabbed a scalpel from the surgical tray. Rios shouted for her to stop, but her intentions were different. She didn't attack him. She cut the tubes that were keeping him stable, sabotaged the monitoring equipment, and took the bag of blood that was to be used for his transfusion. Her plan was crueler and, in her eyes, more just than a quick death. She would leave him alive, but permanently damaged, a powerless cripple, forced to live the rest of his days in a prison of his own broken body, a fate worse than death for a man like him. This was her decisive action, the final move in her game of revenge, a demonstration of power that transcended simple death. She would sentence him to a life of suffering. As Rios tried to process the scene, Mariana turned toward the emergency exit, using El Hierro as her distraction. The final confrontation was not with him, but with the choice she made. By sabotaging his recovery instead of killing him, she proved to herself that she was not just a killer, blinded by rage, but a cold strategist who meted out punishment to fit the crime. She chose torture over oblivion, memory over the end. It was an act of calculated cruelty, the climax of her dehumanization, but also her final testament. She wasn't just killing the monster, she was deconstructing him piece by piece, leaving him to breathe in the ashes of his empire. The sound of his heart monitor's siren becoming a sharp, desperate alarm was the soundtrack to her escape, her symphony of vengeance. In the ensuing confusion, with the police finally securing the hospital and arresting the cartel members, Mariana Cruz vanished. She shed her white uniform and abandoned snakeskin and dissolved into the Mexico City night, becoming just another ghost in a city full of them. She left no trace except for the legend that was born that night in the hospital corridors, the story of the head nurse who became an angel of vengeance. Her revenge was complete, but it brought no peace. El Hierro survived, just as she had planned, but as a shadow of his former self, paralyzed and unable to speak, imprisoned in an inert body to contemplate his sins, a punishment the justice system could never have conceived. Mariana got her justice, but the price was her identity, her freedom, and the last remnants of her soul. Detective Santiago Rios closed the case, officially listing Mariana as a fugitive. In his report, he detailed the crimes, but between the lines there was a tone of reluctant understanding. He visited El Hierro once, in the prison hospital ward, and saw the empty terror in the eyes of the man who had once been a king. Rios felt no triumph, only the melancholy weight of a twisted justice. He understood why Mariana did what she did, and that understanding haunted him. The law had been broken, but a form of cosmic balance, however terrible, seemed to have been restored. He would spend the rest of his career wondering about the thin line that separates a hero from a monster, and whether Mariana Cruz was both at the same time. Life at the hospital slowly returned to normal, but the normalcy was a scar over a deep trauma. Dr. Felipe Ramirez, now a more cynical and sobered physician, never revealed what he knew. He carried Mariana's secret as a penance, his admiration for her forever tainted by the terrible truth. He became a better, more attentive doctor, but he lost the idealism that had defined him. Sophia, for her part, preferred to remember Mariana as the hero who protected her during the shootout, a simplified view that allowed her to continue believing in goodness. The spectre of Mariana remained, a cautionary tale whispered among the new residents about what can happen when the system pushes a good person into the abyss. For Mariana, life became a succession of anonymous cities and false identities. She was a fugitive, forever looking over her shoulder, haunted not only by the law, but by the faces of all those she had killed. The image of her daughter, which once drove her, now judged her in her dreams. She got her revenge, but lost herself in the process. The conclusion of her journey was neither a happy ending nor a clear tragedy, but a bittersweet purgatory. She was a woman free from the pain that had chained her, but a prisoner of her own actions, destined to wander in a self-imposed exile. Justice, she discovered, was a double-edged sword, and in wielding it, she had cut herself as deeply as her enemy. Mariana's story leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Was true justice achieved? Did she become the thing she fought against, or was she the only possible response in a corrupt world? Her journey shows us that pain can be a transformative force for good or for evil. It is a somber reminder that within each of us lies the capacity to care and to destroy. Stories like hers deserve to be told, for they force us to look into the shadows. If you believe that profound narratives like this need a space, subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows me to continue giving a voice to these complex journeys and to explore the limits of the human soul.